Ladies and gentlemen, what is going on? Welcome back to another video. Today we are going over 9 fantasy football players that I would be stashing for later on in this season. I think they could really have some good upside come 3-4 weeks from now. You might have to insert these guys in your lineup, but right now they are sitting on the bench. That is why this is a video about stash players. I will say, by the way, some of these guys are a little more well-known than others, but I will put everybody's name in the description down below, so the timestamps will be available so you can jump around and, figure out who you want to take a look at on this list. We're going to start it off with Jaxon Smith-Njigba, JSN. DK Metcalf sat out last Sunday's game against the Arizona Cardinals, which launched JSN to a bigger role than he would normally have. He finished his day off with 4 catches for 63 yards and a touchdown on 7 targets in that game. Played on 39 out of a possible 59 offensive snaps and ran 24 out of 28 routes, which tied him for the team lead in that category. To mine and most people's surprise, Tyler Lockett really didn't step up too much in DK's absence, which was a little bit disappointing. He finished with just 4 catches for 38 yards on 5 targets. I will say the game script really didn't benefit these receivers much, though. The Seahawks had the lead in this game almost the entire time, which led to them running the ball 32 times compared to only passing 24 times, and Geno only completed 18 of those 24 pass attempts. So of course you would have loved to see a little more pass heavy offensive game script in this one to know exactly what Jaxon Smith-Njigba is capable of doing, but he did give us a nice little sneak peek in this contest of what he provides. He honestly should have had even more fantasy points. He dropped a couple of balls that were right on his fingertips, but they were tough catches. We're not going to knock him for that. We're going to take our 16.3 fantasy points from JSN all day of the week and not complain about it. My only problem here in this situation is if DK Metcalf does return, which he practiced fully on Wednesday, so I would expect that he returns in week number 8. It's going to limit JSN just a bit like it had in the first 6 weeks of the season. I think if there's any possibility of JSN being like a lineup lock type of fantasy football player on your team, it's going to be either if DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett misses time for the remainder of the season, or if JSN can potentially eat into Tyler Lockett's playing time, because I don't think he's going to take DK Metcalf out of this lineup anytime soon. Next up, we have Jake Bobo, who is on the same exact team as JSN on the Seattle Seahawks. Bobo came into Sunday's game with 4 catches for 61 yards on 5 targets, and that's the exact same stat line that he ended with. So he had just as many catches, just as many yards, just as many targets as he did the entire first half of the season so far. He had an amazing touchdown grab in the corner of the end zone. I don't know if you guys saw it, but it was one of, if not the best catch of week number 7, in my opinion. Bobo actually played the most snaps out of any Seahawks wide receiver in that game. And this is the exact same situation for me as is JSN's situation, where Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf are clearly above both of them on the pecking order, but I would also argue that JSN is above Bobo at this moment. I don't think it's really that much of an argument. So right now, Bobo is fighting with 3 other wide receivers for playing time in this offense on a weekly basis. That does not mean I don't think he is in a good stash for the rest of the season, though, in case of any injuries or just that he keeps playing well and he, finds himself getting more snaps in this offense. This is a kid that went to college at Duke, was undrafted, and then he works his butt off to get on this team, then is thrusted into a role where he plays 45 out of a possible 59 offensive snaps, catches a miraculous touchdown. There's definitely some potential here for sure with Jake Bobo. Next up, we have Rashid Shaheed. Now, I will say Rashid Shaheed has not been the greatest fantasy football option so far this season, but there are a lot of things that I like about this young man. Okay, last week he drew 8 targets, which was the most that he's seen so far this year. I do have to add, though, that Derek Carr threw the ball 55 times against the Jaguars on Thursday night. I'm not really sure this would have played out much differently, honestly, because the running game just was not there. You saw all those dump-off passes to Alvin Kamara. Okay, we'll talk about that in just a second. Shaheed also played on 70% of the snaps in week number 7, which was definitely a hefty increase from weeks prior for him. And he almost had a nice touchdown grab in the back of the end zone. Unfortunately, he didn't get his feet down. We would be having a little bit of a different conversation here. If he ended with around 15 PPR fantasy points, we might say, we could plug him in the lineup next week. But as of right now, that's not really an option for us. You can slowly start to see that the Saints are trusting Shaheed more and more and more as these weeks go on, and he's proving to them that he's not only a deep threat guy. He can also be an every down receiver that runs whatever route that you can ask him to. Of course, I like stashing Rashid Shaheed later on for this season in case Olave or Michael Thomas get hurt, or he just keeps playing well and earns more time on the field. But one thing I do have to say is Derek Carr has not looked amazing by any means so far this year. He seems to dump the ball off to Kamara more times than not, but you can't dispute that he's number 1 in deep ball attempts right now, number 4 in air yards, number 6 in total passing attempts, and top 10 in air yards per attempt. These stats lead right into saying that if it keeps up for Rashid Shaheed and he keeps getting this amount of playing time, it's only a matter of time before he produces solid numbers at the wide receiver position for the Saints. Next up, we got Tyjae Spears. Right now, Tyjae Spears on ESPN is only rostered in 33.9% of leagues, which is absolutely ridiculous to me. If Derrick Henry does end up getting traded this year, Tyjae Spears is going to be owned in 90+% of these leagues. You can guarantee that. He is that good. He's that talented of a player. And the fact that he's found success behind Derrick Henry just shows how much he's capable of. Right now, he's averaging 8.2 PPR fantasy points per week. That's actually the exact same number of points that Najee Harris is averaging, and in the same ballpark as Javonte Williams, Dameon Pierce, and Miles Sanders. Now, of course, we don't have the biggest sample size right now from Tyjae Spears, but you have heard me mention this in the past couple of videos, that he ranks inside the top 5 in yards per touch, juke rate, and breakaway run rate, along with being in the top 10 for yards created per touch and true yards per carry. With the trade deadline approaching, you will really find out soon whether Tyjae Spears is going to break out this season or if he's going to have to wait yet another year until Derrick Henry departs from Tennessee. Regardless of what happens, though, I want him on my bench waiting for that starter opportunity. Like we just talked about, anything happens to Derrick Henry, even if he gets traded, if he gets injured, does not matter. Tyjae Spears is going to be ready for that role, and when he gets that starting job, he's going to take advantage. He's going to take full advantage. So I think it's best for both parties if he gets traded. I don't know. That's just me. I don't know. I definitely want to see what Tyjae Spears has in the tank. Next up, we have Jameson Williams. If you look at the stat sheet from week number 7 against the Ravens, you are not going to be impressed whatsoever with Jameson Williams, seeing that he had 0 catches. But what you should also look at is that he had 6 targets, which is double the amount he saw in the previous 2 weeks. And of course, you're going to sit here and say, well, who the hell cares if he has 20 targets, if he doesn't get any catches? And I totally agree with you. That's why he is a stash on the bench for right now. He is not performing at a consistent enough basis for me to put him in my starting lineup, but that doesn't mean there isn't high potential for upside later on this year. Williams also saw the most playing time of the season so far for himself at 44% of snaps. This means they're really trying to get him more involved in this offense, and I think that will ultimately happen within the next couple of weeks here. I really do believe that Jameson, Amon-Ra, and Sam Laporta are going to be the main 3 receiving options on this team come the end of the season, and he's going to be much more successful, by the way, when the Lions can establish early on in the game a dominant running game. They were behind that entire game against the Ravens in week number 7. That will not happen every single week. The Lions are going to bounce back, and so will Jameson Williams. If you are in need of a late season stash for wide receiver, Jameson Williams, not a bad option. All right, now we're breaking into some guys that are a little more deeper league options, I'll say. We have Demario Douglas. So far into this season, Kendrick Bourne has been the most consistent Patriots wide receiver in fantasy football. The past 2 weeks, he had over 16 PPR fantasy points, and he plays on almost every snap of offense. Now, get this. The last time Douglas played an entire game was in week number 4 against the Dallas Cowboys, where he was on the field for 18 out of 55 snaps, or about 33% of those snaps. In week 7, his snap share increased dramatically. He ended up playing on 61.6% of snaps, roughly double the workload that he saw the last time that he was healthy. Although this, of course, could have been because Juju Smith-Schuster was out of this game due to a head injury, I believe it was. Regardless, I don't care if Juju's healthy or not. Douglas is the more appealing option because Juju hasn't even scored over 8 PPR fantasy points in a single game so far this season, while Douglas just put up 11.4 in week number 7. Even though he hasn't played too much this year, Douglas still is ranking top 20 in target separation, and this dude is super fast. He has that explosiveness that you're looking for in a deep threat wide receiver type of guy. This is a similar situation to Rashid Shaheed, though, we talked about earlier, where I don't trust the quarterback situation right now. Mac Jones has struggled too many times this year for me to feel confident in him. He's gotten benched a couple of times, which is why Douglas remains strictly as a late season stash for now on my bench. Next up, we have Tyler Scott. Tyler Scott is a rookie wide receiver for the Chicago Bears who hasn't quite really broken through just yet. So far, throughout 7 weeks, he's only averaged 2.2 PPR fantasy points. So the real question is, why in the world would you want this guy on your roster? Stash him on your roster. Because he's another very fast, very explosive wide receiver who actually had the same 40-yard dash time as Demario Douglas we just finished talking about. Scott is currently stuck behind DJ Moore and Darnell Mooney as the number 3 wide receiver here, but he can easily jump into that number 2 spot behind DJ Moore because we know Darnell Mooney is just not consistent. He's dropped 0 PPR fantasy points in 3 out of 7 weeks so far this season. The main problem that I do see from an outsider's point of view of this receiving core is that they, for the most part, have the same archetype. DJ Moore and Darnell Mooney are both guys that can go deep. So is Tyler Scott. I know DJ Moore is a little more complicated than that. He's very good after the catch near the line of scrimmage and stuff like that. But Darnell Mooney, for the most part, all his attempts are down the field. At least that's what I've seen so far this year. Now, Scott has a very similar body type, speed, and versatility to T.Y. Hilton. That was his most accurate comparison, who turned out to be an amazing player for the Indianapolis Colts. The only question mark here is once again a situation of the quarterback. And number 2 is that the Bears love to run the football. They're actually top 5 in rushing attempts this season, which really limits the receiving core to having just one guy that can thrive in this offense. So until that increases, or until we see what Tyson Bagent can do at the quarterback position, until Justin Fields is back, then Tyler Scott is a deeper league stash for the time being. Next up, we have Michael Wilson. Now, Michael Wilson showed signs in the first 7 weeks of the season so far that he does have what it takes to be a good NFL wide receiver, but he hasn't taken that next step. And can he is the real question that I have in my mind. He plays almost the same amount of snaps as Hollywood Brown on a weekly basis, who is the number 1 wide receiver in Arizona and runs almost the same exact amount of routes. The problem is that their running game is much better than their passing game. Brown is the only guy that you can really start, and that's even been iffy over these past couple of weeks because he's dropped under 10 fantasy points in both of those. All I know is that the Cardinals really need a change desperately, and once Kyler Murray does come back and is the starter on a weekly basis, for all we know, Wilson could emerge as a viable fantasy option once again in that situation. But as of right now, he is sitting on the bench with potential upside later on in this season. And last but not least, number 9, we have Chris Rodriguez Jr. Week number 7 was the first real dose of Chris Rodriguez Jr. that we've seen on the Washington Commanders. He carried the ball 7 times for 31 yards against the New York Giants. Of course, Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson played on more snaps, but Robinson was largely ineffective in this matchup on the ground, except for his touchdown run, and Gibson is really only used in passing down situations. I believe he had 2 catches in that game. Rodriguez isn't the fastest guy in the world, but he certainly is very strong, and that's right up the Commanders' alley because I don't think they're really looking for a shifty type of pass-catching running back. They want a downhill runner who can control the pace of the game if needed. Not saying Rodriguez is going to take over for Brian Robinson Jr. by any means, but the past 3 games, Robinson hasn't seen over 10 carries in any of those. Although I do think that's mostly because the Commanders cannot find themselves winning in any of these games. Regardless, if anything happens to Brian Robinson Jr., then Chris Rodriguez should be launched up in the fantasy football world for sure. Anyways, guys, if you enjoyed this video, make sure, as always, to drop a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you are new. I will catch you in the next one. Peace out.